Assalamu alaikum. Welcome fellow medical students in the lecture series of the pathology of digestive system. This is lecture 3, pathology of gastric diseases, inflammatory and ulcerative lesions. To start with inflammatory processes that involving the stomach. First, gastritis. Gastritis is simply defined as inflammation of the gastric mucosa. مثل ما أخذنا بالesophagitis هو inflammation of the esophageal mucosa. Okay, so it is so simple definition: inflammation of the gastric mucosa. This may be either chronic or acute gastritis. In acute gastritis, there is acute mucosal inflammatory process, which is transient in nature, and sometimes it accompanied by a hemorrhage into the mucosa and erosion. This severe erosive form of disease is an important cause of acute gastrointestinal bleeding. من هو هذا الacute gastritis؟ تمام. The causes of acute gastritis is enrolled in this slide. Between them, the most important is the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, excessive alcohol consumption, heavy smoking, and the other cases. Concurrent erosion and hemorrhage is readily visible by endoscope and is termed as acute erosive gastritis. This is marked by mucosal edema and the inflammatory process, which is traditional for the any acute inflammatory process, اللي هو infiltration of acute inflammatory cells والإديمة وغيرها. Clinical features of acute gastritis. Sometimes it is entirely asymptomatic. It is variable between the entirely asymptomatic, or may cause a variable epigastric pain with nausea and vomiting, or may be presented as a hematemesis, melena, or potentially fatal blood loss. Therefore, we said that it is variable, and this depends on its severity. Chronic gastritis. The chronic gastritis is so important because the features is different. This is a chronic mucosal inflammatory change associated with the mucosal atrophy and epithelial metaplasia. Okay, and epithelial metaplasia. So with chronic gastritis عندنا chronic mucosal inflammation اللي هو develop into mucosal atrophy. شلون يصير عندنا mucosal atrophy؟ flattening of the mucosa with nearly absence of the gastric pits. وبعد epithelial metaplasia اللي هو التحول sometimes into intestinal type. شنو الفرق بين الgastric epithelium or الgastric epithelium والintestinal epithelium? Both of them simple columnar, but gastric type have no goblet cells. Goblet cells is present only in the intestinal epithelium. لذلك من نقول epithelial metaplasia, particularly when there is intestinal metaplasia of the gastric mucosa, معناها نلقى الgastric mucosal epithelial cells بيناتها goblet cells. Okay, فنسميه intestinal metaplasia. Both of them columnar epithelium, simple columnar epithelium. Causes of chronic gastritis is the Helicobacter pylori infection. Okay, Helicobacter pylori infection, while autoimmune gastritis. In Helicobacter pylori infection, there is induction of massive chronic inflammatory state with the resultant formation of the lymphoid follicles in the gastric mucosa with germinal center أيضا. يعني الكرونيك inflammatory cells أيضا راح تسوي، بالإضافة إلى أنه بالإيرلي manifestations يكون massive infiltration of lymphocytes and the plasma cells، later on راح تصير عندنا lymphoid follicles بالميوكوزا with germinal centers. اوكي هذه هي step forward for development of gastric lymphoma. واحنا سابقا اخذنا الجنرال كونسبت اوف نيوبلاجيا بالكورس الاول. قلنا انه one of the most important causes for gastric lymphoma is the H. pylori infection, chronic H. pylori infection. Okay, as well as Helicobacter pylori, because of its induces a severe chronic inflammatory process, so it causes a destruction of the parietal cells and gastric mucosa with a reduction of the gastric acid production. Therefore, it associates with hypochlorhydria. H. pylori infection associated with hypochlorhydria. Okay. Later on, it induces the production of the gastric acid juice and being one of the causes of ulcer. واضح؟ But in case of autoimmune gastritis, هذه يصير عندنا auto antibodies against the gastric glands, particularly the parietal cell. واضح؟ So parietal cell destruction and the mucosal atrophy, loss of acid and intrinsic factor. شنو وظيفة الانترنسيك فاكتور؟ هو اللي يسوي تراب اللي يرتبط بفيتامين B12 in order to enhance its absorption in the intestine. So the absence of intrinsic factor will result in vitamin B12 deficiency with resultant pernicious anemia. Okay, but in case, what is the difference between the case of autoimmune gastritis and Helicobacter pylori regarding infection, regarding the clinical manifestation? In Helicobacter pylori قلنا شنو يصير هنا؟ hypochlorhydria. While in autoimmune gastritis, because the gastric glandular cells are specifically targeted by the antibodies, so there is an achlorhydria, complete absence of the gastric acid or complete loss of gastric acid. Histological changes. أهم شيء به هو الintestinal metaplasia. أهم شيء الintestinal metaplasia. Okay, where in case of H. pylori infection, the development of the gastric lymphoma. Okay, انتهينا من الجاسترايتس اللي هو الأكيوت gastritis والchronic gastritis. خلينا نيجي على الجاستريك ulceration. What is the meaning of ulceration and what is its difference from the gastritis? In the gastritis, we have an inflammation in the gastric mucosa only, while in gastric ulceration, there is a breaching in the gastric mucosa. When يروح هذا البريتشنج according to its severity أيضا أحيانا يسوي لي sloughing بس للميوكوزا ويسوي exposing the submucosa، وأحيانا يتعدى السبميوكوزا أيضا يسوي لها sloughing ويطلع المسكولاريس لاير، وأحيانا حتى يفوت على السيروزا ويسوي breaching، complete breaching of the gastric wall. واضح؟ زين. إذن breaching in the mucosa of the alimentary tract. الchronic gastric ulcer اللي هو الموست common نسميها البيبتيك ulcer. البيبتيك ulcer. This results from the chronic exposure to the gastric acid juice. تمام. This accounting for 98% of peptic ulcers are either 98% of the peptic ulcers are either in the first portion of the duodenum or in the stomach. The causes هو exposure to gastric acids and pepsin or أيضا H. pylori infection. يعني H. pylori infection, chronic infection with H. pylori inducing a gastritis, inducing a gastric metaplasia, inducing a chronic gastric ulceration. كلها هذه due to severe inflammatory process which induce due to in the gastric mucosa due to H. pylori infection, as well as the presence of the enzymes which are produced by the H. pylori itself. زين. احيانا احنا هسه الان قاعد نقول بالكرونيك بيبتيك ألسر قاعد يصير عندنا exposure to gastric acid pepsin. يا بچا ما هو الجاستريك اسيد بيبسين يعني موجود باستمرار، ليش ما يسوي لي ألسريشن إلا في بعض الحالات؟ يعني كل شخص كل الناس اللي عندهم gastric acid juice هم عندهم ألسر؟ طبعا لا، بس الألسر قاعد تصير بسبيسيفيك cases. إذن how can the stomach protect itself from being ingested as a piece of meat by the gastric acid juice itself؟ يعني شلون ما قاعد تهضم نفسها كقطعة لحم، مع العلم أنه هي تهضم اللحم نفسه، تهضم البروتين نفسه. زين. This occur by several steps due to secretion of mucus by the surface epithelial cells. السيرفيس epithelial cells تفرز الميوكس اللي يصير كطبقة تغطي الابيثيليال cells, and this will prevent the direct contact between the acid, gastric acid, and the epithelial cells in the gastric mucosa. هذا واحد. اثنين، بعد تنفرز اكو طبقة جوا الميوكس من البايكربونات اللي هي forming a buffering يعني تسوي فد buffering in the micro environment below the mucus، حتى إذا عبر عندنا شوية من الأسيد على الميوكس جوا الميوكس راح تلاقيها البايكربونات layer، وبالتالي تسوي له neutralization وbuffering وتمنع exaggerated effect of the acid on the epithelial cell. هذه اثنين. بعد ما هي البارايتال سيل هي نفسها قاعد تفرز لنا الأسيد، شلون يعني شلون تحمي نفسها من عنده من تسوي له secretion it produces the gastric acid and pepsin as jets، يعني تقذف قذف. ف this will reduce a direct contact between the epithelial glandular cells the glandular cells in the epithelium and the acid which is produced by itself. زين، يعني شمر مباشرة إلى اللومن. وبعد الرابid gastric epithelial regeneration، وبعد البرودكشن of prostaglandin اللي يسوي لنا maintenance of blood flow. خلينا نركز على ذولي النقطتين. rapid gastric epithelial regeneration، طبعا كل الاليمنتري tract هي undergo continuous sloughing or denudation of the epithelium and regeneration. The elementary tract epithelial cells is highly regenerable. In the stomach, the gastric epithelial regeneration is very fast, and this maintained by the good blood flow in the gastric mucosa. تمام. الرابid blood flow هذا الجود blood flow يجينا منين؟ يجينا من البروستاجلاندين. البروستاجلاندين منين يجي؟ from the action of the COX or cyclooxygenase on the arachidonic acid. هسه واضحة. arachidonic acid عفوا الcyclooxygenase يشتغل على arachidonic acid اللي موجود بالسيل ممبرين، يطلع لنا شنو؟ prostaglandin will maintain the blood flow. The blood flow will enhance the regenerative capacity of the epithelial cells in the stomach. زين، هذه ليش ركزنا عليها؟ لأنه الآن عندنا فد ميكانيزم راح تصير بها العملية عكسية وتؤدي إلى الجاستريك ulceration. شو وقت؟ هسه نشوف. الآن شلون يصير عندنا الجاستريك ulceration in case of H. pylori infection. H. pylori does not invade the tissue. شلون تسوي ulcer? It induces an intensive inflammatory response and the production of the pro-inflammatory cytokines which recruits and activate neutrophils. So by induction أولا of massive inflammatory process with induction of severe or massive pro-inflammatory cytokines. وبعد تذكرون قبل شوية حكينا عن الانزيمز اللي تفرزها مثل اليوريز are causing epithelial cell injury، واحنا عندنا inflammation قاعد يسوي injury. So there is an activation of inflammatory process, not activation, augmentation of the inflammatory process. يعني اكو superimposition ما بين الانفلاميشن واليوريز اللي ينفرز من الهاي من الاتش بايلوري in inducing of the epithelial cell injury. هذه واحدة. بعد phospholipase produces the phospholipase. This damages the surface epithelial cell. وبعد البكتيريال proteases and phospholipases break down the glycoprotein lipid. لذلك راح تحطم الخط الدفاعي الأول in the gastric mucus، وبالتالي حطمت الخط الدفاعي الأول وخلت الميوكس exposes to يعني exposed to the acid which is present in the gastric juice. إذن this will superimpose the problem. إذن أولا راح تسوي لي severe inflammation، وهذا نفسه هو ممكن إنه يسوي cellular injury by induction of the cytokines. هذه واحدة. اثنين اليوريز، الإنزيم اليوريز اللي يسوي epithelial injury. Phospholipase damage the surface epithelial cells. الphospholipase together with the protease يحطم لنا الجلايكوبروتين lipid complex in the gastric mucus، وبالتالي يفتح مجال بالgastric mucus. راح يروح الgastric mucus in certain area of the stomach, and this will weaken the first line of the mucosal defense and make the gastric mucosa in direct contact with gastric acid, which increase the cellular or opportunity of the ulceration. بعد H. pylori enhances the gastric acid secretion. احنا مو قلنا بالبداية راح تسوي لنا destruction of the acid producing cell، وبعدين راح ترجع تسوي hyper acidity. شلون؟ by enhancing gastric acid secretion from another sites of the cells. لذلك راح يكون عندنا بالبداية hypochlorhydria، later on acidity، hyper acidity. So هذه الهايبر acidity will impair the duodenal bicarbonate production, thus reducing the luminal pH in the duodenum, and this will cause a duodenal ulcer. Several H. pylori proteins are immunogenic and evoke the immune response in the mucosa. Both activated T cells and B cells can be seen in the chronic gastritis caused by the H. pylori infection, and this will predispose for the development and augmentation of the massive inflammatory process. Here, chronic inflammatory process, with formation of يعني lymphoid follicles, and this can progress into gastric lymphoma. H. pylori مثل ما جاي تشوفون البكتيريا موجودة على superficial portion of the gastric mucosa. In this image there is an intensive inflammatory infiltrate in the superficial mucosa exemplified by neutrophils. Here هذه neutrophil، هذه neutrophil، بعد هذه okay again eosinophil. إذا intensive inflammation. جاي تشوفون هذه الكرونيك process، هذه lymphoid follicle، هذا germinal center. okay this is lymphocytes. هذا germinal center، وهذه هي border of the lymphoid follicle. one side بالgastric mucosa، هذه هي mucosal glands. and here there is an intestinal metaplasia. شلون عرفنا؟ اكو columnar epithelium. شاوى إذا مو الgastric mucosa هي أصلا containing columnar epithelium. لا، عرفناها من presence of the goblet cells and the gastric epithelial cells have no goblet cells. okay هذا هو الform of the H. pylori. form of the H. pylori. زين. In patients who do not have H. pylori infection, non-steroidal are the major cause of peptic ulcer disease. راح نتوقف عند هذا الحد ونكمل في مقطع آخر.